Across Jordan's silent deserts and wind-cut mountains stand megastructures carved, stacked and engineered with a precision that seems to defy the very landscapes that hold them. Rising in places where water is scarce, tools were limited, and no ancient civilization should have had the means or the reason to build at such scale. Their foundations contradict the timelines we're taught, their techniques outpace the cultures we credit, and their purposes blur as excavation uncovers evidence that fits some narratives while quietly unraveling others. Why do these structures appear more advanced than the societies surrounding them? Why were they built in locations no thriving population should have sustained? And what were their builders responding to? Trade, ritual, survival, or something we still haven't recognized? The deeper we look, the more the ground shifts. So what exactly are these places hiding? And why do their mysteries only deepen the closer we get? Petra. In the deep sandstone valleys, where shifting light moves like a slow tide across rose-red walls, Petra emerges gradually from the silence, its facades pressed into cliffs that seem older than the memory of a settlement itself. And yet, the city's presence feels neither abrupt nor imposed, as though its architects had read the grain of the mountains and answered it with measured cuts that transformed raw geology into inhabited stone. Over time, this merging of craft and landscape has invited a steady curiosity about how a nomadic people could refine a capital of such scale, where processional paths, hydraulic tunnels, and monumental chambers appear to anticipate both ceremony and commerce, without ever revealing which came first. And the soft erosion along the six-winding corridor hints at countless centuries in which water shaped the canyon long before tools arrived to harness it. The Nabateans, whose caravans once threaded the desert routes with incense and spices, are credited with orchestrating Petra's rise. Yet the city rarely conforms neatly to the expectations left by their scattered inscriptions and modest surviving settlements, especially when its most iconic structure, the treasury, stands with a precision that suggests long experimentation with Hellenistic forms blended into local sandstone traditions, while the interior rooms behind its ornate facade remain unexpectedly small, raising questions about their intended function and the possibility that symbolic presence mattered more than spatial utility. Further in, the street of facades stretches beneath high cliff tombs, carved in rhythm with the shifting terrain, and their weathered surfaces record the passage of winds that have softened once crisp lines into muted impressions, leaving researchers to infer their original proportions from eroded remnants that do not always align with stylistic parallels elsewhere in the Near East. Near the centre, the massive theatre, cut directly into rock rather than assembled from blocks, creates a contrast between architectural ambition and the fragility of sandstone, suggesting a community willing to negotiate material limits rather than impose forms borrowed from other cultures. And yet, its seating curves display a geometry consistent with Greco-Roman public spaces, a reminder that Petra's builders were attentive observers of regional design without wholly replicating it. The city's hydraulic system deepens the puzzle, for behind the serenity of carved facades lies an intricate network of channels, cisterns, and dams that redirected seasonal floods, revealing an expertise in water management that surpasses what might be expected from a society long assumed to have been loosely urbanized. And fragments of plaster-lined conduits hint at continuous refinements across generations, even though the written record preserves little about the engineers responsible for these interventions. Climbing toward the high place of sacrifice, the landscape opens into broad plateaus, where carved altars and stairways sit exposed to sun and wind, their edges softened, yet still legible enough to suggest ceremonial functions whose exact choreography remains unknown. And the site's placement above the city offers not only strategic vantage, but an architectural gesture toward the surrounding mountains, perhaps reflecting beliefs that lingered from earlier periods when sanctuary and landscape were inseparable. Deeper in the western reaches, the monastery rises with massive pilasters and a facade stripped of finer ornament, its scale dwarfing the visitor, while its interior chamber remains stark and almost undecorated, provoking speculation about whether its emptiness served ritual, assembly, or symbolic display, and whether its construction responded to a phase of shifting priorities during Petra's later centuries under changing political influences. Archaeological excavations across residential quarters reveal multi-storey dwellings with courtyards and staircases, but the distribution of these structures is uneven, and layers of collapsed roofs complicate efforts to map how the population adapted as trade patterns shifted, especially after Roman annexation, when administrative reforms altered regional routes. Shards of pottery from diverse origins, Arabian, Egyptian, Mediterranean, attest to a cosmopolitan character that does not readily match the enduring imagery of a hidden desert city, while carbon-dated charcoal from domestic hearths suggests long-term occupation that fluctuated rather than simply rising and declining in a single arc, challenging earlier assumptions about dramatic abandonment. Despite the clarity provided by many excavations, contradictions arise in the timelines proposed for certain monuments with some researchers, emphasizing a rapid urban expansion during the first centuries BCE and CE, while others see signs of earlier phases embedded beneath later facades, marked by subtle shifts in carving technique or alignment that imply reworking over time, perhaps reflecting successive adaptations to political or economic transitions. In the quarries above Petra, half-finished capitals and abandoned chisel marks freeze the work of unknown artisans, whose interrupted efforts reveal how facades were drafted directly into living stone, beginning with rough outlines and progressing toward finer detail, though the reasons some pieces were left incomplete remain unclear, whether due to sudden shifts in patronage, structural instability in the rock, or the gradual redirection of labour toward emerging centres elsewhere. As the desert dusk settles across the cliffs, the city's surfaces catch muted reflections that trace the folds of the sandstone, and in that fading light, Petra appears less as a singular creation and more as a layered negotiation between geology, trade, and shifting cultural currents, its monuments resisting any final explanation and inviting instead the quiet possibility that each generation of builders responded to conditions and intentions only partly recoverable through surviving evidence, leaving a landscape where carved walls preserve both the clarity of purposeful design and the open questions of how a community, shaped by caravans and crossroads, transformed stone into a city whose remaining mysteries are not the product of impossibility, but of centuries of adaptation, erosion, and unanswered intentions embedded within the enduring rose-red cliffs. Jerash. In the northern hills, where olive groves break into open plains, Jerash rises gradually from a landscape that once carried only the faint movement of seasonal herders, its colonnaded streets now standing in long, deliberate rows that catch the shifting daylight as though the stones were arranged to measure time as much as space. And here the first impression is not of sudden grandeur, but of a city that grew outward in careful increments, its forums and theatres aligning with terrain that seems to guide rather than resist their placement. The oval plaza, with its sweeping curve of Ionic columns, sets an unexpected rhythm in the otherwise rectilinear grid, prompting questions about whether earlier topography or pre-existing ritual grounds influenced its shape, since no clear inscription explains why this extraordinary geometry was chosen for a civic centre that echoes Roman ideals, yet departs from their typical plans, and as one walks beside the stones, the wear patterns along the bases suggest centuries of foot traffic whose scale exceeds what some scholars expected for a provincial settlement. Beyond it, The Cardo stretches northward in measured precision, its basalt-paved surface marked by ruts, likely carved by carts that once carried goods between workshops and markets, and the regular intervals of column spacing hint at a technical familiarity with Roman surveying. Those subtle shifts in alignment toward the northern gate betray adjustments made to accommodate uneven ground or earlier structures now buried beneath later layers. The south theatre, carved partly into the slope, reveals acoustic design that speaks to experienced builders. Yet, its proximity to civic temples raises questions about overlapping functions, with archaeological trenches exposing reused stones in certain retaining walls that might indicate earlier phases of construction, predating the well-known Roman expansion after the 1st century CE. A reminder that Jerash, or ancient Gerasa, did not emerge fully formed, but layered itself across shifting political and economic conditions. The Temple of Artemis dominates the central rise with its towering Corinthian columns, each drum fitted with impressive precision, though excavations have uncovered evidence of earlier cultic activity beneath the sanctuary's platform, suggesting that the Romans amplified a pre-existing sacred zone rather than imposing an entirely new one. And the carved niches along the retaining walls show varying degrees of craftsmanship, as if multiple workshops contributed over extended periods, leaving slight inconsistencies that now serve as clues to construction sequences otherwise lost. Scattered throughout the city's residential quarters, mosaic floors display hunting scenes, geometric patterns, and vegetal motifs, many of them still vibrant despite centuries of burial. Yet their distribution is uneven, with concentrations in certain neighbourhoods hinting at pockets of affluence that do not align neatly with the city's monumental core, prompting ongoing debates about how wealth and status fluctuated as trade routes shifted and local industries rose or faded. The water system beneath Jerash, pieced together through channels, reservoirs and clay pipes, reveals a sophisticated approach to managing seasonal flow from nearby springs, and sediment analysis from cistern linings shows periods of repair and modification that extend the city's functional lifespan far beyond its commonly assumed decline, even after the 749 CE earthquake that damaged key structures and is often cited as the catalyst for its gradual contraction. Inscriptions found across scattered lintels and freestanding markers provide glimpses into civic administration, including benefaction records and dedications to emperors. Yet, these inscriptions also introduce contradictions when compared to archaeological layers. For some volumes of urban renewal suggested by written sources do not always match the stratigraphic evidence, while certain monumental projects appear to have begun modestly before being expanded over generations, their final forms only loosely corresponding to the intentions of their earliest patrons. The Nymphaeum, with its ornate facade and semicircular basin, presents another puzzle, as its decorative programme shows influences from multiple periods, including fragments of marble cladding that imply later embellishments long after the initial construction, raising the possibility that the city adapted visually to shifting tastes without fully replacing earlier structures. And the partial survival of its drainage system leaves open questions about how water was supplied consistently enough to sustain such a feature during drier years. Further north, the North Theatre's limited seating and proximity to administrative buildings suggest a civic function distinct from public entertainment, though no definitive record clarifies its broader role, and excavations nearby have revealed modest domestic structures pressed tightly against monumental walls, their humble remains hinting at a city where grandeur and daily life intermingled without strict zoning. Even the city walls, whose line can still be traced across surrounding ridges, show phases of reinforcement that do not align neatly with recorded threats, suggesting periodic adjustments to reflect shifts in settlement density rather than responses to external pressures. And the placement of certain towers on bedrock anomalies raises questions about whether surveyors adapted their design to geological constraints that remain only partially documented. As dusk settles across the colonnades, and the long shadows emphasize the rhythm of columns stretching into the hills, Jerash does not present itself as a puzzle built beyond comprehension, but rather as a city whose longevity and layered adaptations obscure the clarity of any single narrative, inviting contemplation of how Roman urbanism, local traditions, and centuries of gradual modification converged into a landscape where each surviving structure reflects not only skilled construction, but also the ongoing negotiation between environment, community, and shifting historical currents, leaving an enduring impression that Jerash's greatest mystery lies not in its apparent perfection, but in the quiet complexity of how its stones accumulated meaning across time. Amman Citadel, high on a windswept ridge, overlooking the layered sprawl of the modern city, the Amman Citadel rises with a quiet persistence that seems to fold millennia into a single contour of stone and earth. Its elevated plateau shaped first by natural uplift, and then by generations who read its vantage as both strategic refuge and sacred threshold. And arriving here, the eye moves across foundations that do not immediately reveal their order. For the site carries traces of Bronze Age enclosures, Iron Age fortifications, Roman temples, Byzantine churches, and Umayyad courts, all resting unevenly upon one another, as if time compressed its own architecture, leaving each era to negotiate space with those that came before. The Temple of Hercules dominates the southern edge, with its surviving columns lifting pale against the sky, their massive bases suggesting an intention for a sanctuary far larger than what was ultimately completed. An excavation around the precinct uncovers reused stones, irregular alignments, and fragments of sculptural detail that hint at earlier structures incorporated into later plans, raising questions about whether the Roman vision for the temple was ever fully realized or whether shifting priorities left it suspended between ambition and practicality. Nearby, the enigmatic Hand of Hercules, an oversized fragment from a colossal statue, rests incongruously in the dust, its scale prompting speculation about how such a figure would have towered above the plateau, though its incomplete survival leaves open the question of whether the statue fell during an earthquake, was dismantled for building material, or simply eroded beyond recognition during long centuries of exposure. Across the summit, the Umayyad complex introduces a markedly different vocabulary, its audience hall framed by a reconstructed dome and flanked by a sequence of rooms arranged around a central courtyard. And the geometric precision of the stone piers hints at a carefully planned administrative centre, yet the scattered debris of earlier periods incorporated into its walls shows a pragmatic response to available materials rather than a clean architectural break, reinforcing the idea that each new phase at the citadel grew from the physical remnants of the last. Beneath these visible layers, the archaeology deepens, for trenches reveal Bronze Age ramparts and domestic installations that predate the monumental phases by centuries, their humble outlines forming an undercurrent to the grander narratives of empire, and soil samples from these layers mark shifts in habitation density that do not always align with a historical record, suggesting episodic occupation that may have reflected regional instability, environmental variability, or changing trade routes linking the Levant to highland caravans. The Byzantine church near the summit introduces yet another chapter, its mosaic fragments and architectural footings indicating a basilica with formal symmetry, though later modifications blur its chronology, and the repurposing of earlier Roman columns for its nave suggests both resourcefulness and a continuity of sacred intention that traversed political transformations. At the edges of the plateau, stretches of retaining walls and defensive structures preserve conflicting clues. Some stones bear Iron Age masonry patterns, Others show Roman rebuilding techniques, and still others incorporate blocks with Nabatean tool marks, creating a composite fortification that resists assignment to any single period. And geological surveys reveal bedrock irregularities that may have influenced the placement of towers and gates. Yet the relationship between these natural features and historical defensive strategies remains only partially understood. Inscriptions uncovered across the site provide glimpses of administrative activity, religious dedication, and civic identity. But gaps in these records complicate efforts to synchronize textual and material evidence, especially when certain inscriptions reference urban features whose archaeological counterparts remain unidentified, implying either that those structures have not yet been found, or that they once stood beyond the present boundaries of excavation. Pottery assemblages from successive layers show gradual shifts in daily habits, trade connections, and storage practices, but their distribution is uneven, with some loci containing unexpectedly rich assemblages in periods thought to have been sparsely occupied, while other layers appear curiously depleted, raising questions about how occupation intensity varied across the summit, and whether certain activities were concentrated in areas now eroded or lost. Even the citadel's commanding view, often interpreted as the prime reason for its long habitation, introduces its own ambiguities. For the plateau's exposure to wind and limited water sources would have posed challenges, and evidence of extensive cistern systems suggests that inhabitants continually adapted to environmental constraints, though the precise mechanisms by which water was stored and rationed remain debated due to the fragmentary survival of hydraulic features. Seismic activity further complicates interpretation, as archaeological layers show signs of multiple earthquakes, some severe enough to realign walls or topple columns. Yet the timing and impact of these events do not always match known historical quakes, leaving open the possibility of localized damage or undocumented tremors that shaped the citadel's evolution. Walking among these overlapping structures, one senses how each architectural fragment participates in a dialogue across centuries. The Roman capitals resting near Umayyad thresholds, the Bronze Age traces lying beneath Byzantine floors, and the shifting urban horizon of Amman spreading below in concentric rings of later history, all contributing to a landscape where beginnings and endings blur. And as evening gathers over the ridge, soft light glancing off weathered limestone, the citadel seems less a singular monument than a palimpsest of intentions, repeatedly inscribed and partially erased. Its mysteries not rooted in impossibility, but in the layered complexity of a place continually adapted to new powers, new beliefs, and new circumstances, leaving behind a summit where each surviving wall gestures towards stories only partly recoverable, inviting careful attention to the fragments that remain, and to the silences between them that still shape the enduring atmosphere of this ancient hill. Wadi Rum. South of the high plateaus, where wide horizons dissolve into dunes and sandstone massifs rise like stranded islands of petrified time, Wadi Rum unfolds as a landscape whose scale makes human traces seem fleeting. Yet along its cliffs, boulders and hidden alcoves, ancient inscriptions accumulate in quiet clusters that sketch a long record of movement across an otherwise austere expanse. Their lines carved with tools that left delicate grooves now softened by wind. And approaching them, one senses how the desert's vast stillness once carried the footsteps of pastoralists, traders, and seasonal travellers who paused briefly to mark their presence before continuing on paths shaped more by terrain and water than by borders. The Nabatean, Thamudic, and Safayitic scripts that appear across the rock faces are often modest in size, their messages ranging from personal names to prayers and simple declarations, and despite their apparent clarity, they reveal only a fraction of the social world that produced them. For each inscription exists in isolation from its author's larger story, leaving scholars to infer patterns of mobility, settlement, and belief through careful comparison of letter forms, carving depths, and spatial distribution, all while acknowledging how shifting sands may have hidden or erased countless others. Geological formations such as the towering Jabal Ishreen and the naturally sculpted arches frame many of these carvings, and their surfaces record not just the inscriptions but also the deep erosional histories that shaped suitable canvases for writing, suggesting that certain cliffs were favoured not merely for visibility but for the quality of their stone, whose fine-grained surfaces allowed inscriptions to persist despite centuries of abrasive winds. Scattered among these markings are depictions of camels, ibex, and hunting scenes, their outlines varying in style and execution. And although some researchers interpret them as indicators of subsistence practices or seasonal movements, the uneven distribution and overlapping carvings complicate any simple reading, for older images sometimes lie beneath newer ones. And in certain places, the recarving of figures implies that meanings evolved as the desert's role in regional networks shifted. Archaeological surveys across the valley floor reveal traces of campsites and hearths, but these ephemeral remains rarely align neatly with the areas containing the densest inscriptions, prompting speculation that the rock faces served purposes beyond the immediate needs of habitation, perhaps as markers of territorial passages, ritual expressions tied to landscape features, or informal signposts for travellers navigating the open desert without constructed roads. Layers of soot in select rock shelters show intermittent use across centuries, though radiocarbon dates vary widely, suggesting that such shelters were visited sporadically rather than continuously. And their relationship to nearby inscriptions remains ambiguous, for the carvings do not always cluster around these ephemeral living spaces, hinting that the act of inscription might have occurred independently of longer stays. In some sectors, Nabatean texts appear alongside earlier Thamudic carvings, their proximity indicating long-term continuity of travel routes rather than abrupt cultural shifts. Yet the variation in stylistic confidence within the Nabatean inscriptions, from elegant formal hands to hurried uneven letters, suggests that literacy levels and carving purposes differed substantially among those who passed through, complicating efforts to categorize them into clean chronological phases. Environmental studies add another layer of uncertainty, as pollen analysis from ancient sediment pockets reveals cycles of wetter and drier periods, implying that Wadi Rum's capacity to support travellers fluctuated over time, and these changes may have influenced inscription density, though the uneven survival of carved surfaces makes such correlations difficult to confirm. Scholars have attempted to map the inscriptions systematically, yet the sheer expanse of the valley and the shifting visibility of surfaces under changing light mean that new clusters continue to be identified, often in places previously surveyed, revealing how easily human observation can miss subtle marks in a terrain dominated by monumental forms. Even the famous Anfashia and Kazali Canyon panels, where inscriptions and rock art converge with unusual clarity, pose questions of sequencing and intention, as some figures appear crudely re-outlined, perhaps centuries after their first carving, creating palimpsests that obscure the original contexts and leave open the possibility that the meanings of certain images were repeatedly reinterpreted by different groups using the same roots. Attempts to understand the valley's inscriptional landscape as a coherent narrative inevitably encounter contradictions, for stylistic comparisons that suggest cultural interaction may conflict with stratigraphic evidence from nearby sites, and certain inscriptions that appear contemporaneous may in fact belong to periods separated by centuries due to the difficulty of precise dating. As evening light descends across the cliffs and the last shadows gather beneath the rock bridges and towering escarpments, the inscriptions soften into faint textures indistinguishable from natural striations. And in that fading moment, Wadi Rum feels less like a desert bearing hidden messages than a place where countless brief moments of human presence became woven into the geology itself, leaving behind records whose clarity remains forever partial, inviting the sense that the valley's true mystery lies not in undecipherable statements or vanished builders, but in the quiet endurance of markings that persist despite the relentless forces of erosion, preserving a fragmentary echo of people who passed through this vast landscape, and left only the faint lines by which we now attempt to remember them. Ajloun Castle, set within the wooded highlands of northern Jordan, where groves of oak and pistachio soften the approach to a ridge long valued for its commanding view of intersecting valleys. Ajloun Castle rises not from mythic origins, but from a precise moment in the late 12th century when regional powers sought vantage points capable of observing shifting frontiers, its limestone walls following the contours of bedrock so closely that the structure appears less placed than sculpted from the hill itself. And ascending its outer slopes, one senses the logic behind its position, for the surrounding ridges fall away in broad arcs that reveal both distant horizon lines and the subtle passages through which caravans or armies once moved. The castle's design, attributed to the Ayyubid general Izz al-Din Usama, presents an irregular but deliberate geometry, its towers angled to cover approaches rather than to impose perfect symmetry. An excavation within the courtyard exposes foundations that show phases of expansion, particularly the Mamluk additions that thickened the walls and altered internal corridors, indicating that the castle evolved as defensive needs changed, rather than emerging fully formed from a single architectural plan. The stone itself, quarried nearby, contains small fossil inclusions and subtle colour variation that mark layers of ancient seabed uplift. And masons appear to have worked with the strengths and weaknesses of this material in mind, reinforcing corners with larger blocks and using lighter stone for upper courses, yet later repairs blur original tool marks and make it difficult to distinguish Ayyubid masonry from subsequent restorations, especially after the significant damage caused by earthquakes in the 13th and 20th centuries. The vaulted rooms within, including storerooms and passageways linking the towers, bear soot traces and uneven plaster layers that hint at periods of intense occupation as well as intervals of quieter use, though stratigraphic deposits yield pottery and small metal objects that do not always align neatly with recorded phases of military deployment, suggesting that domestic activities may have coexisted with defensive ones in ways not fully documented by surviving records. The castle's water system, consisting of cisterns carved into bedrock and channels guiding runoff from limited rainfall, reveals a practical adaptation to the site's exposed elevation, though sediment cores from these cisterns show irregular maintenance intervals, leaving open questions about how water storage was managed during prolonged sieges or dry seasons, especially given the absence of a reliable spring within the immediate vicinity. The entryway's elaborate gatehouse, with its bent-axis design intended to slow intruders, reflects a military architectural vocabulary common across the region, yet slight deviations in its dimensions compared to contemporary fortresses suggest local adjustments, possibly influenced by the topography or by the builder's own evolving experience. Crossbow bolts and arrowheads found in certain corridors indicate episodes of conflict, but their contexts do not always correlate with written accounts of specific battles, introducing uncertainties about whether they reflect skirmishes unrecorded in historical chronicles or simply remnants from training exercises or later reoccupation. The castle's strategic role in monitoring the routes between the Jordan Valley and Northern Highlands becomes clearer when standing atop its towers, where the view reveals a web of ridgelines and valleys that would have guided medieval movement, Yet the absence of detailed administrative records leaves many questions about how information gathered from these vantage points was integrated into broader regional strategies, and whether the castle functioned primarily as a deterrent, an observation post, or a logistical node supporting nearby settlements. Interior staircases, some narrow and steep, show signs of recutting, their treads uneven where later occupants modified access routes, and small apertures in the walls, interpreted as arrow slits or ventilation openings, vary in shape enough to suggest experimentation or adaptation rather than strict adherence to standardized forms. The discovery of a small olive press near one of the outer walls complicates assumptions about purely military function, indicating that the castle may have supported limited agricultural processing, perhaps during longer periods of peace or as part of a self-sustaining garrison economy, though its exact operational period remains uncertain due to fragmentary ceramic evidence. Inscriptions within the castle are sparse, and the few that exist often commemorate repairs or expansions rather than original construction, reinforcing the sense that much of the builders' activity went undocumented, their intentions surviving only through architectural clues and the interplay of walls, vaults, and defensive lines that speak through form rather than text. As evening falls and the forested hills fade into muted greens and greys, Ajloun Castle sits quietly above the valleys, its silhouette softened by centuries of weathering, and in that gentle light the structure does not evoke an enigma of forgotten artistry, but rather a layering of practical responses to strategic need, its mysteries arising from the gaps left by incomplete records, altered masonry, and the long erosion of context, leaving a fortress whose enduring intrigue lies in how its stones preserve both the clarity of medieval engineering and the subtle ambiguities born from repeated adaptation, occupation, and the shifting landscape it was built to watch. Shawbak Castle. South of the highland passes where the terrain begins to loosen into desert, Shawbak Castle comes into view as a solitary crown on a rounded hill, its form appearing gradually through bands of pale limestone and windswept scrub that hint at how the fortress once commanded a crossroads between caravan movement and pilgrimage routes. And approaching its outer slopes, one senses the deliberateness with which the early 12th century Crusader builders chose this summit, its vantage neither dramatic nor concealed, but positioned to observe the long approaches from the Araba to the east and the rising plateaus to the west, a placement that suggests strategy shaped as much by supply lines as by defence. The castle's earliest core, attributed to Baldwin I, reveals an irregular geometry adapted to the undulating bedrock, and excavated sections of its foundation show how masons negotiated the fractured limestone using stepped courses and filled voids, leaving later generations to puzzle over which stones represent the first fortification phase, and which were added during subsequent Ayyubid and Mamluk repairs that altered not only the skyline, but the internal circulation of the entire complex. Weathered towers line the perimeter, some polygonal and others more rounded, and though their surviving arrow slits and embrasures offer hints of medieval defensive priorities, their varied orientations reflect modifications, responding to changing tactical concerns rather than a single cohesive blueprint, while earthquake fractures, especially those attributed to the 1212 and later tremors, complicate attempts to reconstruct original heights and curtain wall configurations. Inside, the vaults show differing levels of craftsmanship, some finely cut with clear Crusader tooling, others rougher and likely part of Ayyubid restorations, and the layering of plaster across several chambers reveals patches of domestic occupation, perhaps suggesting that periods of garrisoning fluctuated as regional alliances shifted, though excavation of associated pottery layers does not always align neatly with the documentary accounts that describe prolonged sieges and intermittent control. The celebrated well shaft, descending deep into the hill through a spiralling subterranean stairway, introduces one of Shawbak's most intriguing features, a hydraulic solution that appears both ambitious and pragmatic. Yet, soil analyses from within the shaft suggest periods of silt accumulation inconsistent with continuous use, leaving open questions about how reliably the garrison could access water during moments of isolation, and whether supplementary cisterns, some of which are only partially mapped, played a more central role than once thought. Across the upper courtyard, collapsed chambers enclosing traces of workshops and storerooms bear evidence of repurposing, with ash deposits and scattered iron fragments hinting at metalworking activity. Though whether this was routine maintenance, siege-related production, or later reoccupation remains uncertain due to the intermingling of layers disturbed by centuries of collapse and erosion. On the southwestern flank, the remains of a small chapel exhibit faint fresco fragments beneath soot-darkened vaults, their iconography too incomplete for confident interpretation. And archaeologists debate whether these decorations belong to the early Crusader phase or represent later repainting, an ambiguity heightened by the absence of securely dated pigments from surviving samples. Ayyubid inscriptions found near the main gate commemorate restoration efforts after the castle's capture by Saladin, but the masonry surrounding the inscription incorporates earlier blocks, some with cross-shaped mason's marks, demonstrating how each phase absorbed the structural vocabulary of the previous era, creating a composite architecture that resists efforts to divide the castle into clearly bounded chronological stages. Beyond the walls, terraced slopes reveal traces of agricultural installations, including shallow channels and low retaining walls that suggest attempts to cultivate or manage runoff around the fortress. Yet the extent and consistency of such efforts remain unclear, as environmental studies indicate fluctuating rainfall patterns and shifting vegetation that may have alternately supported and challenged these endeavours. The castle's role in regional networks also introduces uncertainties, for textual sources describe both heavy taxation on caravans and extended periods of diminished activity. But archaeological evidence, limited coins, sparse trade goods, and uneven debris distribution offers a more complex picture, implying that Shawbak's economic function was not constant, but responded to broader political and geographic shifts that redirected traffic toward or away from its influence. Subterranean corridors, some partially collapsed, trace confusing routes beneath the inner ward, and while these passages have fueled speculation about escape tunnels or hidden storage, systematic mapping shows that many were practical service spaces or structural cavities created during successive building phases, their current opacity resulting from centuries of infill rather than intentional secrecy. The retention of certain Crusader-era architectural elements, such as stubby pilasters and remnants of a great hall whose proportions can be inferred only from a scatter of fallen blocks, contrasts with later Islamic additions that introduced pointed arches and modified entryways, creating visual discontinuities that complicate efforts to envision the castle as it appeared during any single moment in its history. As the sun lowers across the plateau and the castle's walls cast elongated shadows down the hill, Shawbak seems less a fortress frozen in medieval narratives than a long-lived structure shaped by cycles of control, repair, and adaptation, its stones carrying both the clarity of intentional engineering and the ambiguities left by incomplete records, erosion, and evolving use. And in the quiet that settles over the hilltop, the castle's enduring mystery arises not from any suggestion of impossible construction, but from the subtle, cumulative traces of centuries in which each generation altered, reinforced, or abandoned spaces whose original purposes have grown faint, leaving a sprawling complex whose resilience lies in the way its fragmented evidence continues to prompt reflection on how a strategic stronghold became a layered monument to shifting histories, each still partially concealed within its weathered walls. al-Jimal. Across the basalt plains of northeastern Jordan, where the land stretches into quiet expanses marked by dark lava flows and the muted outlines of ancient routes, al-Jimal emerges as a settlement whose architecture seems shaped as much by the volcanic landscape as by the societies that once lived among its clustered walls, its black stones absorbing heat by day and releasing it slowly into the evening air, creating an atmosphere in which time feels compressed yet strangely diffuse. And approaching the site, one first notices how the buildings do not dominate the terrain, but rather echo it, their rough-hewn blocks mirroring the fractured texture of the surrounding Hara fields. Unlike cities built with imported materials or carefully dressed limestone, al-Jimal grew from what the desert already offered, its inhabitants splitting basalt boulders into workable forms that retain the irregularities of their parent rock, and the resulting structures, towers, residences, stables, courtyards, and churches, stand in dense concentrations that suggest both practicality and resilience, though excavations reveal that the settlement's growth was far from uniform, with some districts expanding rapidly in late antique centuries, and others showing signs of intermittent use that challenge earlier assumptions of consistent occupation. The remains of multi-story houses, their collapsed floors creating layered mounds of stone, hint at a domestic architecture more intricate than the stark exteriors suggest. And the presence of internal staircases, upper rooms, and screened windows indicates a concern for privacy and climate control. Yet the precise distribution of these features varies unpredictably across the site, raising questions about whether social status, family size, or purely structural considerations governed the layout of individual homes. The so-called barracks and the Westchurch complex introduce further uncertainties. For while their outlines are generally clear, the associated finds, ceramics, glass fragments, and occasional inscriptions do not always align cleanly with the architectural phases proposed by early surveys, and more recent stratigraphic studies suggest that many structures underwent cycles of reuse, with some originally serving agricultural or storage purposes before being adapted for domestic or communal functions. al-Jimal's distinctive watchtowers, scattered across the settlement in varying states of preservation, add another layer of complexity, for their proximity to residential clusters, rather than solely to perimeter lines, complicates simple defensive interpretations. And archaeological investigation shows that some towers were integrated into homes as structural anchors or vantage points overlooking courtyards, blurring the line between military and domestic use. Water management, crucial in this arid environment, was achieved through a network of cisterns carved into basalt bedrock and fed by carefully guided runoff. Yet sediment deposits within these cisterns show irregular usage patterns suggesting fluctuating population levels or periodic abandonment. And although early scholars proposed that al-Jimal supported a sizable community over several centuries, recent analyses indicate that occupation may have varied dramatically with regional political shifts, trade fluctuations, and environmental changes affecting the nearby wadis. Inscriptions scattered across the site, written in Greek, Safavitic, and later Arabic scripts, provide glimpses of administrative, military, and personal histories. But these fragments raise new questions when compared with material evidence, for some refer to structures or officials for which no clear archaeological counterpart has been identified, while others seem to commemorate renovations or dedications in buildings whose original functions remain uncertain. The 14 churches commonly mapped across the settlement offer a striking density for a community often assumed to have been modest in population, though excavation reveals that not all were active simultaneously, and some may have been private chapels or reused domestic spaces, with mosaic fragments and architectural carvings surviving unevenly, leaving scholars to reconstruct liturgical arrangements from partial clues such as column bases, apsidal outlines, and scattered reliefs. The basalt stables, perhaps among al-Jimal's most evocative structures, retain feeding troughs and narrow entryways that reflect the significance of animal husbandry. Yet the relationship between these facilities and broader economic networks remains only partially understood, especially since the settlement lies near routes linking the Decapolis cities with desert frontiers, and the mix of Roman, Byzantine, and early Islamic material culture suggests shifting roles that may have alternated between frontier outpost, agricultural village, and caravan stop. Seismic history further complicates interpretation, for evidence of collapsed upper floors, crushed door lintels, and shifted wall alignments points to multiple earthquakes, but distinguishing which damage corresponds to which event is challenging, and some buildings appear to have been abandoned after structural failure, while others were reforged into new forms, their reused stones obscuring the chronology of reconstruction. The so-called praetorium, long identified as an administrative or military building, presents an especially tangled narrative, with its imposing walls hinting at official function, yet its interior showing traces of domestic occupation, and more recent assessments suggest that its label as a formal headquarters may reflect early assumptions rather than definitive evidence, leaving the building's exact role open to reinterpretation. The settlement's overall layout, often described as organic, may reflect not deliberate planning but the gradual accumulation of structures responding to family needs, economic shifts, and the availability of open space. And remote sensing reveals that buried walls extend beyond the visible ruins, implying phases of contraction and expansion not immediately evident on the surface. As the sun descends and shadows lengthen across the dark basalt, the city acquires a muted glow, its broken outlines blending into the volcanic plateau until individual buildings dissolve into a continuous field of stone. And in that quiet moment, al-Jimal feels neither abandoned nor incomplete, but suspended between the clarity of its surviving architecture and the ambiguities of its layered past, its mystery residing not in any suggestion of impossible engineering, but in the way a community shaped by frontier landscapes, shifting powers, and persistent environmental challenges left behind a settlement whose basalt walls preserve both the endurance of ordinary life and the silence of centuries in which so much was built, reused, reimagined, and finally allowed to weather quietly into the desert plain. Qasr, al-Abd. In a quiet valley west of Amman, where cultivated fields taper into low hills and the evening light settles gently across a landscape shaped more by springs and terraces than by dramatic cliffs, Qasr al-Abd rises with an unexpected solidity, its pale limestone blocks forming a rectangular monument whose proportions feel both measured and enigmatic. And approaching it along the shallow basin, one notices first the stillness of its placement, neither perched defensively nor embedded in a larger urban plan, but standing almost alone beside what was once a reflective pool that doubled the mansion's facade in shimmering symmetry. Attributed to the Tubiad family of the early Hellenistic period, the structure appears at once ambitious and incomplete. Its two-story design preserving carved felines, eagles and ornamental friezes that soften the severity of its massive ashlar masonry. Yet the precise purpose of this rare example of Hellenistic palace architecture in Jordan remains elusive, for its scale seems grand for a rural estate, yet modest for a ceremonial complex, and the absence of extensive surrounding buildings raises questions about the social and administrative world that could have supported such a construction. The quality of the stonework suggests experienced craftsmen, perhaps drawing on regional Hellenistic traditions, yet the irregularities in certain block joints and the unfinished surfaces on the upper story hint at a project interrupted or adapted mid-construction, while quarry marks on nearby slopes reveal extraction techniques consistent with contemporaneous sites, though the sequence of transportation and assembly remains open to debate due to the scarcity of direct inscriptions or construction notes. Archaeological surveys of the pool and its surrounding terrace indicate a planned landscape with channels designed to regulate water levels and possibly to accentuate the visual impact of the palace. Yet, sediment analysis shows that the pool underwent cycles of silting and clearance, implying phases of use that may not align neatly with the building's primary occupation, and the absence of clear evidence for elaborate gardens or outbuildings complicates efforts to reconstruct how the estate functioned within its rural setting. Inside, the lower halls, with their thick walls and minimal openings, suggest a cool refuge from summer heat, while the upper story, accessible through broad staircases now partially collapsed, appears to have been lighter and more decorative, though the lack of surviving floors makes it difficult to determine how spaces were divided or furnished. Fragments of stucco and plaster found in limited excavation imply internal ornamentation, yet their distribution is uneven, leaving unclear whether the decoration was extensive or concentrated only in select areas. Nearby, carved animal sculptures, including the well-known lions that once may have served as fountains, introduce further ambiguity. For their stylistic execution blends symbolic motifs common in Hellenistic contexts with local artistic conventions, and their placement on the retaining walls flanking the pool suggests a ceremonial or aesthetic function, though centuries of weathering and displacement make it difficult to determine their original arrangement. Early accounts by travellers in the region described the structure as a fortified barracks or even a small castle, interpretations now largely discounted. Yet these early misreadings reflect the challenge of situating Qasr al-Abd within familiar architectural categories, for it lacks the defensive features of a fortress, the ritual markers of a temple, and the extensive layout of a palace complex, leaving scholars to consider possibilities ranging from a luxurious estate to a monumental family seat, intended to project authority within a localized socio-political landscape. Some clues emerge from the broader archaeological context of Iraq al-Amir, where caves bearing inscriptions associated with the Tabiad lineage suggest a family presence predating the mansion's construction. Though the precise relationship between these cave installations, the administrative activities they imply, and the monumental building below remains uncertain due to gaps in the textual record and the fragmentary nature of the surviving inscriptions. Seismic history introduces another layer of complexity, for the region has experienced multiple earthquakes, and evidence of structural displacement, particularly in the upper blocks, could indicate damage early in the building's life, possibly contributing to its incomplete state. Yet, distinguishing between ancient seismic effects and later collapse remains difficult, given the repeated cycles of stone reuse and erosion. The isolated placement of Qasr. Al-Abd also raises environmental questions, for while the valley's springs would have supported modest agricultural activity, the resources required for such a large construction project suggest a coordinated effort that may reflect brief periods of political autonomy or economic ambition not fully documented in contemporary sources, and the surrounding terraced hillsides, though they show signs of ancient cultivation, do not yet provide enough evidence to clarify the agricultural capacity that might have sustained a large household. Pottery shards across the site range from Hellenistic to Byzantine and early Islamic periods, indicating intermittent reuse long after the main structure fell out of primary function, though these later occupations appear to have been opportunistic rather than transformative, adding layers of ambiguity rather than clarity to the building's chronological narrative. As late afternoon light moves across the facade, the carved animals soften into elongated silhouettes, and the rectangular mass of Qasr al-Abd takes on a reflective stillness that mirrors the lost pool it once overlooked. And in that quiet moment, the structure feels neither abandoned nor unfinished, but suspended between architectural aspiration and historical obscurity. Its enduring mystery, not rooted in any impossibility of construction, but in the selective survival of evidence, the contradictions between monumental ambition and rural context, and the subtle traces of a family and a vision whose fullest story remains partly concealed within weathered walls that continue to invite measured, thoughtful scrutiny.